You were young guys. You needed to go off on your own.
And he'd found, as you say, Yoko, his muse.
Paul McCartney, one of the legendary voices behind the Beatles, has been a towering figure in the music industry for decades. Alongside John Lennon and George Harrison, Paul helped shape a band that forever changed the course of music history. Though the Beatles disbanded in the 1970s, their legacy continues to resonate. Now, at 82 years old, McCartney is finally addressing a long-standing mystery, his feud with Yoko Ono.
Man, shout out to Daniel Bildo with the Buy Me Coffee donation request. He wanted to kind of have me take a look at this one as well. And this one is called At 82, Paul McCartney finally breaks the silence on Yoko Ono feud over the Beatles split. All right, so shout out to the Ultimate Expedition YouTube channel. Want to give them their shout out and give them their credentials, man. Links to their channel will be in the description below. I always want to give credit where credit is due for all their hard work. This, for me, is just for educational purposes and learning, and plus adding my own content to, you know, my own comments into this thing, because this thing is deep, you know. So with that being said, let's let the man cook.
And the role she may have played in the band's breakup.
Well, you know, I've been blamed, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 years now.
So you were aware of that going on?
After years of speculation, he has broken his silence on the feud with Yoko Ono over the Beatles breakup. Was she really the reason for the split? Or was it just a coincidence that she entered John's life when things were already tense with the band?
The biggest question is how and where did they meet? Did I miss that? Because it's like one of the documentaries was looking at Yoko just kind of appeared like a secret character. Like,
But looking back on it, you think the guy was totally in love with her.
Yeah.
And, you know, you've just got to respect that.
Join us in this video to find out. But before we unveil his revelations, let's trace it back to Paul McCartney's early life. Paul McCartney, early life. Paul McCartney was born on June 18, 1942, at Walton Hospital in Liverpool. His mother, Mary Patricia, worked as a nurse. Both of his parents had Irish roots. Paul has a younger brother, Michael, and a younger stepsister, Ruth, who was born from his father, Jim's second marriage. Even though their father was agnostic, Paul and his brother were baptized as Catholics following their mother's faith. But religion wasn't a big focus in their home. Before World War II, Jim worked as a salesman for a cotton company. When the war started, the company closed, and he took a job as a lathe turner at a factory while volunteering for the fire brigade at night. The family moved a couple of times during Paul's childhood, first to a flat in Knowsley in 1944, and then to a council house in Speke in 1946. After the war, Jim went back to his old job, but he earned less money, so Mary's job as a midwife became the main source of income. Paul went to Stockton Wood Road Primary School in Speke, but because the school was overcrowded, he moved to Joseph Williams Jr. School. In 1953, he passed.
Dude, for the kids that went to school with Paul McCartney, man, and maybe he got picked on by a few guys, maybe he got bullied or anything like that, and to know that this little kid that you sit next to in class is finna be one of the richest musicians of all time. Like, you just don't know where life leads you, and then you try to look at the trajectory of like where his father and how he was moving at the time. And it's a weird thing because, like, when you look back on your ancestry and you see how much of your relatives were moving around, man. And these are people that you are connected to, whether it be DNA, relationship-wise. And I like looking at that aspect because you begin to understand somebody on a level that's deeper than music. And you kind of understand how they think the way they think, you know?
An important exam that allowed him to go to a grammar school, the Liverpool Institute, which was better than a regular school. In 1954, he met George Harrison on the bus to school, and they quickly became friends, though Paul later admitted he sometimes talked down to George because George was a year younger. Paul often spoke highly of the people he grew up with in Liverpool, saying they were smart and down-to-earth like his dad. The family moved to a house at 20 Forthland Road in Allerton, thanks to his mother's earnings as a midwife. Paul remembered her riding her bike to visit patients, even in the middle of the night, in snow-covered streets. Sadly, when Paul was 14, his mother died from complications after breast cancer surgery. This loss later helped him connect with John Lennon, whose mother also passed away a couple of years later. Paul's father, Jim, was a musician who played trumpet and piano. He led a jazz band in the 1920s and kept a piano in the house, encouraging Paul and his brother to learn music.
That's wild. Shout out to Dad, man. Being a jazz musician in the 1920s. Huh. How? You know, that makes me want to look up something, you know, jazz in the 1920s. Like, what did that sound like? You know, but also like I'm very keen to like watching the movement of people. So I was like, how did his dad pick up on jazz? Was that like when he was in the service or something? Or, you know, these genres, it's kind of weird because a lot of these genres didn't get coined until the 1940s and 50s and stuff. So to hear 19s, 20s jazz music, I wonder how that would sound.
Cancer surgery. This loss later helped him connect with John Lennon, whose mother also passed away a couple of years later. Paul's father, Jim, was a musician who played trumpet and piano. He led a jazz band in the 1920s and kept a piano in the house, encouraging Paul and his brother to learn music. Paul didn't enjoy formal piano lessons and preferred to learn by ear. When Paul was 11, his dad encouraged him to try out for the Liverpool Cathedral Choir, but he didn't make it. Instead, he joined the choir at St. Barnabas's Church. For Paul's 14th birthday, his father gave him a trumpet, but when rock and roll became popular, Paul traded it for a guitar so he could sing and play at the same time. Since he was left-handed, Paul found it hard to play the guitar right-handed. But after seeing a poster of Slim Whitman, who also played left-handed, Paul switched the strings around to suit him. He wrote his first song, I Lost My Little Girl, on that guitar, and later composed When I'm 64 on the piano. Paul was influenced by American rhythm and blues, and Little Richard was his idol.
Didn't I tell y'all? Influences are key? Influences. A lot of people don't want to acknowledge that some of these musicians had big influences, man. Yeah.
Paul was influenced by American rhythm and blues, and Little Richard was his idol. The first song Paul ever performed in public was Long Tall Sally at a talent competition during a family holiday. From a young age, Paul had the chance to play musical instruments and fell in love with it. Will this journey lead him to fame, or will it face obstacles? And what does he now say about Yoko Ono? Stay tuned to find out Paul McCartney's early musical career.
Have you heard my new album yet? That is probably the worst album, the album I hate most.
When Paul McCartney was 15 on July 6, 1957, he met John Lennon and his band, the Quarrymen, at a church event in Woolton. The Quarrymen played rock and roll in a style called skiffle, which mixed jazz, blues, and folk music. Not long after,
I want to hear that. Skiffle. Never heard of that. Jazz. Okay.
in a style called skiffle, which mixed jazz, blues, and folk music. Not long after, the band invited McCartney to join as a rhythm guitarist, and he and Lennon became close collaborators. George Harrison joined in 1958 as the lead guitarist, and in 1960, Lennon's friend from art school, Stuart Sutcliffe, joined as the bass player. By May 1960, the band experimented with different names, like Johnny and the Moondogs, Beatles, and the Silver Beatles. Finally, in August 1960, they settled on the name The Beatles and added drummer Pete Best just before starting a 5-show residency in Hamburg. In 1961, when Stuart Sutcliffe left the band...
So Ringo wasn't an original member? Or is that Ringo's real name? Hold up. No, that's Ringo.
Beatles. Finally, in August 1960,
so that must be Ringo's
they settled
real
on the
name.
The Beatles and added drummer Pete Best just before starting a 5-show residency in Hamburg. In 1961, when Stuart Sutcliffe left the band, Paul McCartney became their bass player. It's not clear if he took on the role willingly or reluctantly. While they were in Hamburg, they recorded their first professional track as the Beat Brothers, backing English singer Tony Sheridan on the song My Bonnie. This led to Brian Epstein noticing them, and he became their manager in January 1962. In August...
Oh, they were just using pictures then, because it said in 1962, Ringo Starr replaced
1962,
So there probably
Ringo
wasn't no
Starr
images with the
replaced
original
Pete Best
drummer.
as their drummer. The Beatles had their first hit with Love Me Do in October 1962. They became popular in the UK in 1963 and in the US the following year, with fans creating a frenzy known as Beatlemania. McCartney was often called the cute Beatle by the press. McCartney, working with Lennon, co-wrote several early Beatles hits, including I Saw Her Standing There, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, 1963, and Can't Buy Me Love, 1964. In August 1965, the Beatles released McCartney's song Yesterday, which featured a string quartet. This was their first song to include classical music elements and was recorded with just McCartney. Yesterday became one of the most covered songs in music history. Later in 1965, during the recording of the album Rubber Soul, McCartney began to take a bigger role in the band's music. McCartney and Lennon both contributed to the song In My Life, and McCartney described the album as a move away from their earlier cute image. In 1966, the Beatles released Revolver, an album known for its advanced lyrics, studio experiments.
That's kind of wild because cute label. That's kind of how they label pop bands. Like when I was growing up in the 90s, like Britney Spears, Christina, and they get to a point where they want to mature, they have to step out of that popsy element and look like grown men and women. So I felt like the Beatles like had to go through that as well.
Revolver, an album known for its advanced lyrics, studio experiments, and a mix of musical styles. McCartney's single Paperback Writer came out before the album, and they made short films for the song and its B-side, Rain.
And background music got some good rhythm.
McCartney's song Eleanor Rigby, which had a string octet and was praised for its unique style. The Beatles played their last commercial concert at the end of their 1966 U.S. tour. Later that year, McCartney worked on his first solo project, composing a film score for The Family Way. He collaborated with producer George Martin, who used McCartney's themes to create variations. To get why Yoko Ono was connected to the Beatles, we need to...
Okay, finally. I thought this video was about him breaking his silence on Yoko. So I guess it was important for him to go back and kind of create all the context. But I still feel like maybe that wasn't necessary. Let's just get to the meat of it, you know?
Check out her early life. Stick around as we explore her beginnings. Early life of Yoko Ono. Yoko Ono was born on February 18, 1933, in Tokyo to Isoko Ono and Eisuke Ono.
Wait a second, 1933? So in 1970, this lady would have been in her 40s. Wait a minute, 1980? She would have been almost 50 years old. She is... what, 9 or 10 years older than Paul? So Yoko would be 90 now. I think, is Yoko gone?
1933, in Tokyo to Isoko Ono and Eisuke Ono. Her father was a wealthy banker and a former classical pianist, and her mother came from a wealthy family with connections to the Yasuda clan. Yoko's name means ocean child. 2 weeks before Yoko was born, her father moved to San Francisco for work. The family joined him when Yoko was 2 years old. Her younger brother, Keisuke, was born in December 1936.
I think that's Kisuke. I don't think it's Keisuke. I think it's Kisuke.
Was 2 years old. Her younger brother, Keisuke, was born in December 1936. In 1937, the family moved back to Japan, and Yoko started attending Gakushuin, an elite school in Tokyo. She took piano lessons from ages 4 to 12 or 13 and went to kabuki shows with her mother, who was skilled in various traditional Japanese instruments. The family moved to New York City in 1940, but soon after, her father was transferred to Hanoi, so the family returned to Japan.
Dang.
Yoko went to Keimei Gakuen, a Christian primary school in Tokyo. During World War II, they were sheltered from bombings in a special bunker, and after the war, they lived through severe food shortages. Yoko's family had to beg for food and trade their belongings for essentials. Her mother even traded a sewing machine for rice to feed them. After the war, Yoko stayed in Japan while her family moved to Scarsdale, New York. By 1946, she returned to Gakushuin, which had reopened. The school was close to the Imperial Palace and had not been damaged by the war. At 14, she began studying vocal training and leader singing. Yoko Ono graduated from
What is leader singing?
She began studying vocal training and leader singing. Yoko Ono graduated from Gakushuin in 1951 and was the first woman to enter the philosophy program at Gakushuin University. However, she left after 2 semesters. In September 1952, Ono joined her family in New York and started studying at Sarah Lawrence College. Although her parents supported her college choice, they disapproved of her lifestyle and the friends she made.
Oh yeah, we at the height of the the height of the sexual revolution in the 60s, man. Hey.
Her college choice, they disapproved of her lifestyle and the friends she made. In 1956, Ono left college to marry Japanese composer Toshi Yanagi, who was studying at Juilliard. At Sarah Lawrence, Ono studied poetry, English literature, and music composition. She admired 12-tone composers like Arnold Schoenberg and Alban Berg. Her music began to explore avant-garde styles influenced by composers such as Edgar Varese, John Cage, and Henry Cowell. She left college in 1957, worked as a secretary, and took lessons in traditional Japanese arts. Ono was linked with the Fluxus Group, a collective of avant-garde artists. Lithuanian-American artist George Makiunas gave her a solo exhibition in 1961 and invited her to join Fluxus, but she chose to remain independent. She collaborated with Fluxus artists like George Brecht and Jackson McLough. In 1960, Ono rented a loft at 112 Chambers Street in Manhattan, where she hosted avant-garde events. This space became a hub for experimental art, attended by notable figures like Marcel Duchamp and Peggy Guggenheim. Ono's first major public performance took place at Carnegie Recital Hall in 1961, featuring radical experimental music and art. At the Chambers Street events, Ono displayed conceptual artworks like Painting to be Stepped On, where the art changed as people walked on it. She also contributed albums.
I didn't know they can do that at that time, though. So looking at Ono's life, like she's been surrounded by music. So a lot of the times, like in the earlier like documentaries, we would take a look at like, why is she in the Beatles studio? And that's what I'm thinking. Like, how did she meet John? So she met John probably being in the same studio or being something surrounded with the art and the music. It's probably going to say that a little bit later, but so she seemed like she knows, like she's been around music. So this gives her a little bit more accreditation. This should give her more accreditation even with the Beatles fan base. But personally, I still feel like she didn't need to be in the studio with them.
Album cover
she wasn't
art
a member.
for Toshiro Mayuzumi's album, Nirvana Symphony, in 1962. After living separately for several years, Ono and Ichi Yanagi divorced in 1962. Ono returned to live with her parents in Japan and, struggling with depression, was briefly admitted to a mental institution. How was Yoko Ono connected to the Beatles?
Yeah.
Did she meet them through one of the band members? Let's find out what brought Yoko and the Beatles together. Yoko Ono and John Lennon relationship. Yoko Ono first contacted the Beatles when she visited Paul McCartney in London in hopes of getting a Lennon-McCartney song manuscript for a book by John Cage. McCartney didn't give her the manuscript but suggested she ask John Lennon. Lennon later gave Ono the handwritten lyrics to The Word. Ono and Lennon met on November 7, 1966 at the Indica Gallery in London, where Ono was showing her art. Gallery owner John Dunbar introduced them. One of Ono's pieces, ceiling painting Yes Painting, had a ladder and a magnifying glass. When Lennon climbed the ladder and looked through the magnifying glass, he saw the word Yes written in tiny letters. He liked this positive message compared to other art he saw, which was often negative. In a 2002 interview, Ono mentioned that she was very attracted to Lennon. She began sending him her art, and they started writing to each other. In September 1967, Lennon helped with Ono's solo exhibition at the Listen Gallery in London.
Dude, it's just something about her hair. The way she wears her hair just makes her look so scary. It just kind of reminded me of The Ring a little bit. Okay, so she meets, I kind of guessed it, I guess. She met him through the arts. So I'm assuming by that time, John probably wasn't aware of her musical experience, but more attracted to her for just her being in art. And then seeing that one of her pieces were very positive. I can see that. I can see it just kind of.
Lennon helped with Ono's solo exhibition at the Listen Gallery in London. Lennon's wife, Cynthia, was curious about the phone calls from Ono, and Lennon told her it was just about Ono's avant-garde work. In early 1968, while the Beatles were in India, Lennon wrote the song Julia and included a reference to Ono, calling her Ocean Child, based on the meaning of her name. In May 1968, while Cynthia was away, Lennon invited Ono over. They spent the night recording avant-garde music, which became their first collaborative album, Unfinished Music No. 1, Two Virgins. When Cynthia returned, she found Ono at home, wearing her bathrobe and drinking tea with Lennon. On September 24th and 25, 1968,
my boy was cheating.
Lennon wrote and recorded Happiness is a Warm Gun, which had references to Ono. Ono became pregnant but sadly miscarried a boy on November 21st, 1968, shortly after Lennon's divorce from Cynthia. On December 12, 1968, Lennon and Ono appeared in a BBC documentary about the Rolling Stones.
Well, a BBC documentary is diabolical.
Lennon and Ono appeared in a BBC documentary about the Rolling Stones. Lennon performed Your Blues with Ono adding her voice, but the film wasn't released until 1996 because of the death of Rolling Stones member Brian Jones. On March 20, 1969, John Lennon and Yoko Ono got married at a registry office in Gibraltar. They spent their honeymoon in Amsterdam, where they held a week-long bed-in to promote peace. They had planned to do another bed-in in the U.S., but were not allowed into the country. Instead, they held it at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in Montreal, where they recorded the song Give Peace a Chance. Lennon later said he regretted giving Paul McCartney credit as co-writer on the song, since Yoko had actually helped him write it. Lennon and Ono often mixed their activism with performance art. One example is Baigism.
Okay, so this is around the time where the Beatles probably had took in a break and they split, and all the guys were kind of on their own spiritual journeys. So, because I remember George was on his, Lennon was on his, and I think after they went to India, there was like this big break that John Lennon had. So I could, they looked like they was attached at the hip, like, and they seemed like they were like kindred spirits, like they were just together. They were just together all the time. He was feeling her. So, hey, I'm kind of looking at this being kind of genuine. All right, I'm looking at this being very genuine. You know what I mean? Very genuine relationship between them two.
Which they introduced during a press conference in Vienna. They wore bags over their entire bodies to make fun of how people judge each other based on appearance.
But I think there's something, it's almost something beautiful about it, you know, because all on the beat.
Lennon talked about this time in the Beatles song, The Ballad of John and Yoko. Yoko Ono, John Lennon's partner, caused quite a stir in the Beatles. But how did she really get along with the other guys? Was it a love fest or a total disaster? Keep watching to find out. Yoko Ono's relationship.
Oh, I see what he's doing. Okay, I see what's going on.
With the Beatles. In June 1969, Yoko Ono and John Lennon were hurt in a car accident while working on the Beatles' Abbey Road album. After the crash, a bed with a microphone was set up in the studio so Ono could give her thoughts on the album. Some people believe that Ono's constant presence in the studio caused tension between Lennon and the other Beatles.
I agree with that.
For example, George Harrison once had a heated argument with Lennon after Ono took one of Harrison's biscuits without asking. The British press began calling Ono the woman who broke up the Beatles. Paul McCartney had joked about this possibility in 1969, saying it might be remembered as Yoko sat on an amp. Lennon denied that Ono was responsible for the breakup. Harrison also said the Beatles
because it was already seeds of destruction in the Beatles by that time. I think she might have been responsible for tipping the cup over, probably.
had issues long before Ono came along. Ono herself has stated that she did not cause the breakup and didn't even try to. During the Beatles' time, all songs by Lennon and McCartney were credited as Lennon-McCartney, whether they were written together or by just one of them. In 1976, McCartney released a live album with Beatles songs credited as P. McCartney J. Lennon.
Wait a minute, but at the same time, these guys are lifelong friends, man. They met each other as teenagers. Oh, man, this actually hurts a lot more. This actually hurts a lot more. These are lifelong friends talking and feuding over things. That's why I feel like this was so deep. This was so deep, man. No Diddy.
But neither Lennon nor Ono objected.
I just know, just for days, you just couldn't think that he was gone, you know.
After Lennon's death, McCartney tried to change credits to McCartney-Lennon for some songs, but Ono refused, saying it broke an agreement she had with Lennon. McCartney's attempt to change credits was criticized as an attempt to rewrite history. In a 1987 interview, Ono suggested that McCartney played a part in the Beatles' breakup.
Everybody
For the
played a part.
1998 album Lennon Legend, the song Give Peace a Chance was credited solely to Lennon, even though Ono helped him write it. In 2002, McCartney's live album again listed Beatles songs as Paul McCartney and John Lennon, sparking more debate over song credits. Ono did not sue, but continued to argue against these changes. In 1995, when the Beatles released...
Oh, yeah, because I think legally the wording matters. That's why it says McCartney and Lennon, but then later on it was like Paul McCartney and John Lennon or P. McCartney, J. Lennon. Like that stuff legally is very important. Like, just watching some attorneys and stuff like that. Like that stuff, that's a big deal in the business world.
Lennon's Free as a Bird and Real Love, Ono and McCartney worked together on a song called Hiroshima Sky is Always Blue to mark the 50th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing. Ono once compared Lennon to Mozart and McCartney to Salieri, which upset McCartney's wife, Linda, who was terminally ill at the time. After Linda's death, McCartney did not invite Ono to her memorial. In 2005, Ono accepted an award and talked about Lennon's insecurities about his songwriting. She reassured him that he was a good songwriter. In a 2010 interview, Ono spoke about their reconciliation after Lennon's Lost Weekend and credited McCartney with helping them. McCartney had asked Ono what would bring her back to Lennon, and she answered, which McCartney later shared with Lennon. McCartney later said he did not blame Ono for the Beatles' breakup and acknowledged her influence on Lennon's solo work. Paul McCartney finally spills the beans on Yoko Ono's impact on the Beatles. Did she really break up the band, or was it just bad timing of her relationship with John? Keep watching to find out. Paul McCartney confession about Yoko Ono. For a long time, people blamed you for the Beatles' breakup. Did you know people were saying that? Yeah, I've been blamed for like 30 or 40 years now. I was very aware of it because it felt like people kept poking at me. When you met Yoko, she said she didn't know who the Beatles were, but she did because she had met you. What's your version of the story? My version is that we were in London and Yoko showed up at my house knocking on the door. Someone told me there was a Japanese lady outside, so I said, okay, let her in. She told me it was John Cage's birthday and that some artists wanted to collect manuscripts to give him as a gift. Honestly, I didn't want to do it, but I thought maybe my friend John would. I told her, John lives here, and she went to see him. That's how I remember it. When you were recording the song Get Back, Yoko was in the studio. John accused you of looking at Yoko every time you sang the song, and he took it as an insult. Those were really paranoid times. We didn't welcome Yoko into the studio because we saw it as a guys-only thing. Our girlfriends or wives wouldn't sit in the studio with us. They might visit the control room quickly, but actually sitting with us during work was different. We were like, no, we're working. Did you have the courage to tell John that? No, I didn't. But it was obvious. John was really intense about it. We had this unspoken rule that no one would sit in on a session. So Yoko was there, and it created some awkward
It's just John, but it's like the guys needing to voice their opinions too. Yeah, this junk is wild.
moments. It was hard to start fresh with her around. I even started writing songs about white walls, thinking John and Yoko might like that. This wasn't a typical relationship, and Yoko wasn't an ordinary woman. But weren't you being passive-aggressive? You were upset, but didn't tell John, this is bothering me, I can't work with someone watching. Instead, everyone was just fuming and sulking. Did John ever ask permission to bring her in?
Yeah.
No, he didn't. The initial shock was seeing Yoko sitting on one of the amps. I thought, that's my amp. Can't she use a stool? It was pretty mind-blowing for me. Did Yoko break up the Beatles? I never blamed Yoko for the breakup like others did. In the beginning, it was tough because John was ready to move on. Yoko introduced him to a different avant-garde world which fascinated him. She showed him new ideas, asking if he liked something more than just rock and roll. John loved strong women like his mother and his auntie who raised him. His first wife wasn't like that.
Yeah, now we getting somewhere. 21, we getting somewhere, okay? All right. He liked his strong women. A lot of men like women. A lot of men like women that are closer to, that resembles their mom. So that make a lot of sense.
She once told me, all I want is a guy who comes home, relaxes with a pipe and slippers. But that wasn't John. She didn't realize he was the wrong guy for that.
The story is, before Yoko and I became involved, I was going to produce her as an artist, she wanted to make records.
Meeting Yoko came at a time when John was ready to move on. I felt like John needed to make a clean break. To be with Yoko, he couldn't have anything tied to the Beatles following him around. He had to give his life to her. It wasn't because of her demands. It was what John wanted. People get that wrong. He was deeply in love with Yoko, and they wanted to be as close as possible, always together. It was like, okay, let them be together. It's not so bad. We all got a lot from each other, but eventually, it was clear John had to choose between Yoko and the Beatles.
Yeah.
Yoko didn't break up the group. It was already happening. She just attracted John to a new way of life. Without Yoko, we might have continued as the Beatles, but John fell madly in love with her. He needed a huge change, and he got it. He moved to New York and left behind his English connections. You can't blame him. That's what he wanted. We had to step back and let them have their relationship. What were we supposed to do?
Wait a minute, was that AI? Look at John's eye, yo. Yeah, that's definitely AI. Y'all look at that. What is that atrocity poking out of his cheek right there? No more AI pictures, okay? All right?
We had to step back and let them have their relationship. What were we supposed to do? Call him up and say, hey, John, come hang out with us and leave Yoko. That was never going to happen. After the Beatles, Yoko was John's main partner in everything. He didn't write with anyone else except her. I was the only other person he wrote songs with before Yoko. In the end, I even came to believe that Yoko played a big role in John's solo career. Songs like Imagine were inspired by her. She was his muse, and he went on to be very successful in that second part of his career, writing songs like Imagine and Give Peace a Chance. I don't think he would have done that without Yoko. She was taking John in a completely new direction. The avant-garde stuff that we liked and admired in others suddenly became his world, and he was fully on board with it. Paul's issues with Yoko after John's death. Before John died, he and Yoko were living in New York, where she managed their business. There were always rumors about Paul and Yoko not getting along. Recently, Paul and Linda met Yoko for a reunion. Should people have been surprised? Everyone seems to think Yoko and I were at war, but that's not really the case. Over the last 10 years, we've actually had a better relationship, especially in the last year or so. We've been able to talk to each other more easily. It's strange, but she's a nice person. We didn't really know her well until recently, maybe since the early 80s. One day I thought maybe I had misunderstood her all along, so I called her and we talked about random things. She asked why I was calling, and I told her that I thought I had made a mistake in how I saw her. Since she was John's wife and I cared a lot about John, I felt like he would have wanted me to call and check in. She replied, "Don't do me any favors. Don't do it out of pity or sympathy. I don't need that." At first I was surprised, but then I realized she was right. I had thought she was a tough person, but now I see her differently. I think she's a very loving and caring woman. I used to think she was pushy, but now I see that she's just being herself and she's more determined than some people to stay true to who she is.
Yeah, they got a lot of people like that sometimes.
While others might give in. There's this funny moment when a reporter told Sean and Yoko that Paul McCartney had just been knocked off. But what he really meant was that Paul's latest record had dropped on the charts. Given John's tragic death, saying Paul had been knocked off was a poor choice of words. What the reporter meant was that Paul's record had dropped to number 6 in the charts. Yoko responded with a joke, saying she was still rising, and apologized to Paul, asking how he felt about it. Paul said he felt great. Later, Paul was asked if he could laugh about the time Yoko claimed she didn't know who John or the Beatles were. He said, "I don't know, man. I just believe in live and let live. Life's too short for all that stuff. We've moved past it." But Paul also admitted that he has to talk to Yoko regularly for Beatles business, so they have to get along to some degree. He joked that if he said Yoko wanted him romantically or knew who the Beatles were all along, it would ruin their business relationship. He said, "I'd be dead meat in those meetings." Their relationship wasn't perfect, but they managed to work together. Paul acknowledged that despite their differences, Yoko was a good person, and being able to work with her and Sean was an honor. He also recognized that John was deeply in love with Yoko, and if John wanted her in the studio, they had to accept that. Paul now feels John had the right to bring her in, though it might have been better if John had been more open with the group about his feelings.
You see that? Yeah, John should have been more open with the group. But like I always say, like everybody's at fault. Like everybody's at fault. You know, Yoko should have had enough self-awareness. Like, hey, let me get out of here. Let me go hang out with the other wives. John should have been like, yo, my bad, fellas. Can she come in here? Paul should have spoke up. You know what I'm saying? So communication is everything, man.
But ultimately, Paul understood how much John loved Yoko. You just have to respect her. So we did, and I still do. Paul McCartney spoke up and tried to clear things up by saying, "Look, for everyone blaming Yoko, that's not fair." Yoko appreciated that, saying it was kind of him, and she was sure she got a lot of letters from people upset with her because they liked the idea of her and Paul being in a fight. People also like having someone to blame, and Yoko was an easy target. She and Paul have known each other for so long, and she thinks he's a sensitive, smart guy. So he understood what was really going on. It looks like one of music's biggest feuds may finally be over. After all these years, Paul McCartney says he has made peace with Yoko Ono, ending one of rock's longest-running disagreements. In a Rolling Stone interview, Paul said that time, the great healer, helped them reconcile.
And he had a few other sayings. Nothing's too much, just out of sight.
Right.
You know, so I loved all these little sayings.
He realized that if John loved Yoko, there had to be something special about her. John wasn't a fool. Paul admitted that holding on to a grudge he never really had didn't make sense. They were just upset because the Beatles were breaking up, and Yoko often got blamed for it. Paul seems to have reflected on his life and decided it wasn't worth leaving things unresolved. What do you think about this new revelation by Paul McCartney about Yoko Ono? Did she really split up the Beatles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video shown on.
All right. So Paul really didn't break his silence. Like it wasn't really nothing new. Good title, by the way, my brother. From one to YouTube to another. This was interesting, man. There was a lot going on. And I just wanted to kind of sit back and let it play. And and not really talk over it a little bit because like maybe there was some like new information that'll be brought to me, but I do like the backstory on Yoko. I think the video should have really just focused, if they're going to do anything backstory, we pretty much know everything about Paul and the Beatles, but focus on Yoko and then get to the resolution. This video should have been only about maybe 15 minutes max, but I mean, I get it. They have to deal with each other for Beatles issues. I think we learned about that a little bit with the whole thing with Michael Jackson and buying the Beatles catalog and everything. So we definitely see the correlation. I just think their relationship should have been fine anyway. There had to be a lot more going on, man. But they only let us see what they wanted us to see, being them and giving us information as the public. So it's like, I'm pretty sure there was a lot more to this. But it wasn't really nothing we didn't know already. So post comments down below. Let me know what you guys think. Man, catch you guys at another one. All right. Peace.